كما بدأكم تعودون فريقا هدى وفريقا حق عليهم الضلالة إنهم اتخذوا الشياطين أولياء من دون الله ويحسبون أنهم مهتدون. And when they commit an immorality, they say, we found our fathers doing it, and Allah has ordered us to do it. Say, indeed, Allah does not order immorality. Do you say about Allah that which you do not know? Say, my Lord has ordered justice, and that you maintain yourselves at every place of prostration, and invoke Him, sincere to Him in religion. Just as He originated you, you will return. A group He guided, and the group deserved error. Indeed, they had taken the devils as allies instead of Allah, while they thought that they were guided. Thank you.
Thank you. Alison Weir is a freelance journalist and the founder of If Americans Knew, an organization that focuses on independent research and information distribution with a particular emphasis on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and Middle East issues. Ms. Weir founded the organization after traveling independently throughout the West Bank and Gaza Strip in 2001, when she found the situation largely the opposite of what was being reported by the American media. In 2004, Ms. Weir was awarded the title of Courageous Journalist Lecturer on behalf of Human Rights from Pi Alpha Literary Society at Illinois College, becoming the first woman to ever receive this distinction. Ms. Weir's articles can be found on the If Americans Knew website, ifamericansknew.org. Today, Ms. Weir will be narrating the findings from her independent travels, discussing the reality that the American media does not fully report all the facts of the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And it is one of her organization's beliefs that when Americans know the fact, they will, in the final analysis, act in accordance with morality, justice, and the best interests of their nation and the world. Without further ado, Ms. Alison Weir.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. There's so much. I was earlier adding still more slides to my presentation. There's so much to tell, so I'll try to do it as efficiently as I can. But I'll start out by just explaining about myself a little bit for those of you that didn't hear me speak earlier. 11 years ago, I knew almost nothing about Israel-Palestine, like most Americans. I don't happen to be Muslim or Arab or Jewish, and I'd never focused on this issue before. At that time, I was the editor of a very small newspaper in Sausalito, California, writing about the school district, the fishing fleet. The Middle East seemed distant, confusing, and irrelevant to my daily life. So I would skim the headlines on that important topic, accept the confusion that I found, and I would just move on, the way most Americans do. But then in fall of 2000, I began to see those images of children throwing stones against tanks. And I finally decided to pay attention to just learn what this was about. When I did that, I quickly noticed that it seemed to me we were getting very one-sided coverage. I would hear from and about Israelis a great deal, as we should, but when I expected to hear from and about Palestinians also, that came much less frequently. We should hear from both. It's a two-sided conflict. So I began to look into it more and more, and the more I looked into it, the more shocked and outraged I became. This curiosity basically changed my life about 10 years ago. So today what I'll be trying to do is tell something about what the media leave out. I'll be trying to fill in the massive amount of information that we should also be getting that we are not getting. This isn't an ideological perspective. I don't feel this is a situation of liberals against conservatives. Many people present it that way. I feel that's wrong. It's just that we need to get all the facts, and most of us are not getting those from across the political spectrum. We're not getting it. I won't be telling information much about things that are well covered, that are thoroughly covered in limited time. So suicide bombings are tragic on every conceivable level. If those were not being reported, I would be going around the country telling people they exist. However, when these happen, They are reported movingly and thoroughly everywhere one looks. Every television station, every newspaper, every radio station news tells about these as they should. Similarly, we do hear about rockets being fired from Gaza. These are small, homemade projectiles, almost always. One person likened them to kitchen pipes, but there are thousands that have been fired, and we do hear about those. Interestingly, although the American media almost always mention rockets from Gaza, they never give the number about how many fatalities they have created in the years they have been used. Well, I looked that up a while ago, and the number was 18. In case I'm wrong, let it say 20. So under 20 people have been killed from these rockets. I don't know why the media, when they always tell us about the rockets, don't give us this additional very important fact, but they don't. Many people feel that the media is biased, that it's not doing a good job. We almost always agree on that. Where we disagree is which direction it's biased in. So it's important to, and I don't think, I am a journalist. I believe in journalism. I don't think it always is biased. I think most journalists are trying to do overall a good job, and I think most are. But sometimes that's not the case, just like most doctors are not committing malpractice, but in a hospital sometimes some are. So to understand this, we wanted to do some studies where we would choose a category that was universally significant and that was quantifiable. My son is in physics and math. I like the idea of a scientific study that is immune to subjective bias as much as possible to study the coverage of this. We decided to look at coverage of deaths among both populations. I think we all agree that's a significant topic. What's unusual is we talk about both populations. So we looked at the mainstream, some of the major media, and then some local media as well. And we especially looked at the first year of the current uprising that began in fall of 2000, because first years are so powerful. They set the context within which people ever after view a conflict. They determine, first impressions determine for us many things. So we wanted to look at that first year and then later years. The first thing we needed to do was look at how many human beings were killed that first year. Using an Israeli source, we discovered that 165 Israelis had been killed by Palestinians, and 549 Palestinians at least had been killed by Israelis. How were these deaths covered by our primetime network news shows? Well, we found that they reported on Israeli deaths at rates 3 and 4 times greater than they reported on Palestinian deaths. Some of you may ask, why is it over 100% reporting on Israel? We were counting every time there was a report about a death. So if there was a follow-up report about people burying loved ones or grieving or something, that would be counted for both populations. We knew it theoretically could exceed 100%. We were astounded. I used to be astounded, now I know how typical it is, to see that for Israeli deaths it's almost always over 100%, sometimes much over, and Palestinian deaths never even close to 100%. Then we looked at a subcategory that is even more significant, and that is children's deaths. All people feel that children are illegitimate targets of strife. They should not be killed, but they are being killed. So this is very horrifying and saddening to us, and also very newsworthy. So how many children were killed? And by child, I use the international definition of child, which is 17 and below. And many among both populations have been far below. Some have been toddlers and infants. So how many of these deaths were there that very first year? Well, 28 Israeli young people were killed, and 131 Palestinian young people were killed by the other side. By the way, 91 of those Palestinian children were killed before a single Israeli child was killed. So how were these covered by our primetime network news shows? They had reported on Israeli children's deaths at up to 13 and 14 times greater than they reported on Palestinian children's deaths. In other words, as you can see, the Palestinian children's deaths, even though they occurred in such great numbers, far greater than the Israeli children's deaths, are almost invisible to many Americans because they are so minimally covered. Another way of looking at that is this chart. We can see the dark blue in the Israeli reports on Israeli children's deaths are the number of reports that exceeded the number of deaths that had actually occurred, giving Americans the impression that more Israeli children are being killed than really are being killed, because we hear about them so often. Whereas for the Palestinian population, it's the opposite, where most of the Palestinian children's deaths we never even learn about. So when we think we're learning about this issue and are comparing what's going on, we are comparing this to this instead of that to that. We also charted this information chronologically during the course of those first 12 months. This one is from our study of the New York Times, the newspaper of record. It's often called the most important newspaper probably in the United States. This first line is the New York Times reporting on Israeli children killed that first year. Next, we'll see the actual death rate for Israeli children that first year. And it's similar curve, but lower, because the New York Times also had quite a few follow-up reports on Israeli children. Next, we'll see the New York Times reporting on Palestinian children's deaths that first year. And it's this red line below the other lines, but a similar curve, very similar curve. That's the New York Times reporting on Palestinian children's deaths. Next, we'll see the actual death rate of Palestinian children killed by Israelis that first year. And here it is. This bizarre pattern is what we find again and again in all of our studies. National Public Radio, many people will tell me, well, they listen to NPR, they feel that that's a more reliable source of information, and therefore they know about Israel-Palestine. Pro-Israel groups have consistently been attacking NPR, claiming that it is pro-Palestinian in its coverage. They caused a lot of financial damage to a number of NPR affiliates, saying that NPR was pro-Palestinian in its coverage. So an organization called FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, a well-respected media watchdog organization that's been around for many years, decided to do a study of NPR's reporting to discover if these serious accusations were accurate or not. Their researcher Seth Ackerman did a very thorough study, and he discovered that yes, NPR was very distorted, but in the opposite direction. Once again, we see in a pro-Israel direction. They covered almost 90% of Israeli children's deaths and only 20% of Palestinian children's deaths. He gave his study a brilliant title. He called it The Illusion of Balance, because he discovered that NPR had almost the exact same number of news stories about Israeli children's deaths as about Palestinian children's deaths, making it seem to most people that this was balanced, accurate coverage, not slanted, not biased. In reality, it was the opposite. That's not balanced coverage, that's distorted coverage. One could suggest that it's manipulative coverage, and that's NPR. Now, bad as this is, and this is off the charts of unacceptable journalism, it becomes even worse when we look at local, regional media. For example, we did a study of the San Jose Mercury News a number of years ago. This was one of our first studies. This is the newspaper of Silicon Valley, of Stanford University. We looked at their front page headlines because that's all many people see, especially on international news. We're so busy. So you at least scan the front page headlines. Those are the big stories of the day, and you feel you at least have an idea of what's going on. But you cannot evaluate coverage if you don't actually know what's going on to compare it against. So we needed to know how many people were killed during that period. Again, using an Israeli source, we found 121 Israelis of all ages had been killed by Palestinians, and 384 Palestinians had been killed by Israelis. How was this covered in front page headlines by this typical American newspaper? Well, they reversed it. So while that was going on, this is what it looked like to the people who read that newspaper. I was astounded again, because imagine if the Mercury News had reported the World Series wrong. What if they'd gotten the Super Bowl backwards? They would have been the subject of jokes by late-night comedians around the country. And here they were committing a distortion, a reversal of that magnitude, having to do with lives and deaths, and no one noticed it. There are so many other omissions, I'll go into a few of them. There is dissent in Israel. There are soldiers, there are women's groups, there are rabbis groups, there are humanitarian groups that are very actively dissenting from Israeli governmental policies. When I speak about Israeli soldiers during this lecture, please remember that there are many soldiers that are dissenting and there are Israelis that are refusing even to serve in the Israeli military. That's a very important aspect of this conflict that we almost never hear in our news reporting. We also rarely hear about the nonviolence movement in Palestine. Many people, good, intelligent people, will say to me, you know, if only Palestinians would use nonviolence, that's so powerful and so effective and very moral. They do. There are nonviolent marches and demonstrations at least twice a week, every week in the Palestinian territories, in the West Bank and in Gaza. I have been at these. They are often small villages that are trying to use nonviolence the way they know that Martin Luther King used, that Mahatma Gandhi used. They are doing these nonviolent demonstrations, and they are being joined by people from around the world. Sometimes Israelis are joining these. People from all parts of the world, of all ethnicities, of all races, of all ages, are joining in this nonviolent movement. And yet it's almost never reported to us, even though it's extremely significant phenomenon. In some ways, perhaps unique in some aspects. Very important historically, and yet almost never mentioned by our U.S. media. And these are very courageous actions because they are virtually always met by Israeli military violence, often lethal violence. This is a partial list of people that have been killed taking part in nonviolent demonstrations on their own land against the confiscation of their land, being killed by our ally. And yet we almost have heard of almost none of these in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, and the LA Times. Most of these are Palestinians that have been killed, but some have been Americans. Some have been foreigners that have been killed. Many have not been killed, they've just been injured. Again, if these were being done by Palestinians, we would and do hear about them. When it is being done, and it's being done in far greater amounts, by Israelis, they're almost never reported. Rachel Corrie was 23 years old when she was crushed to death by an Israeli bulldozer. We heard about that briefly. We didn't hear about Tom Prindle, who was 21 years old, when he was shot in the head. What was his crime? He was helping small, quite small, Palestinian schoolgirls for help. He was trying to help these girls, and he was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper. That is confirmed. That's a newsworthy event. We didn't hear about it. Others have only been injured. Brian Avery, Tristan Anderson from Oakland, California, this girl from Sweden. These are all newsworthy stories. We're not getting them here. We're getting a very filtered selection of the newsworthy items that are coming from Israel-Palestine. A very different type of omission, because those were all people taking part in nonviolence and what happened to them. This is a very different omission. This occurred on Capitol Hill in 2003. There was an extremely high-level, official, well, semi-official, briefing on Capitol Hill by the Independent Commission on the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty. There that day on Capitol Hill was Admiral Thomas Moorer, retired. He had been a 4-star admiral. He had been the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. That's the highest military position in the United States. With him that day was Rear Admiral Merlin Starr. He had been, before he retired, the head of the whole legal department for the U.S. Navy. Part of their commission, part of their report, but not on Capitol Hill himself that day, was because he died just a little while before the actual event, was General Ray Davis. This was a Marine general, the highest-ranking Medal of Honor recipient in the United States. You cannot get a higher-ranking independent commission to testify on Capitol Hill than that. They said that their finding about the Israeli attack on a U.S. Navy ship that occurred in 1967 was an act of war against Israel by the United States, that they had murdered American servicemen, that this had been ordered covered up, by the White House and the Secretary of Defense. These are grave statements by officials of the highest rank made on Capitol Hill in the Rayburn House Office building. Normally they would be headlines. Normally there would probably be hearings, further discussion about them. And yet none of this was reported by the Washington Post, by Fox News, by USA Today, by NPR. To read the details on it, you can go to the Congressional Record where there's a thorough report. And you can, the Stars and Stripes newspaper, the military newspaper abroad also had very good report out of that visit. Overall, the U.S. connection in some ways may be the most significant omission of all, because there are important issues all over the world, of violence, of injustice, of oppression, of tragedy. It is very difficult to keep up with all of them. Many people try to, but it's very difficult to do that. However, if we have a close connection to them, then I feel it is essential that we be well informed on issues that we are connected to for two reasons. One is, to me, the moral reasons. If you are impacting other human lives, then I feel it is your responsibility to at least know how you are impacting them. And if you don't care about morality, there is the self-interest reason as well. If you are impacting other human lives negatively, there is a high probability that they will at some point impact your life negatively as well. For both of those reasons, it is essential to get full information on this topic, because we are very connected to Israel. We give Israel over $8 million per day of our tax money. This is more than we give to any other country on earth, more than we give to all the starving countries of Africa put together. And Israel is one of the smallest countries on earth and ranked quite high in terms of its wealth. And yet it gets massive amount of U.S. money. We also, our government consistently vetoes efforts by the international community having to do with Israel. So we are very connected to this issue. That is why it is so essential that we know about it. By the way, in addition to the $8 million per day that we give to Israel, our Congress just recently voted another $200 million to them for a weapons system that our own U.S. companies are developing that will compete with our weapons systems here, with our U.S. companies, taking still more jobs away from American citizens at a time of financial crisis. Did you read that in the New York Times? I didn't see it there. Or NPR or CBS, it's not being covered. One more fact about this U.S. connection part is that this massive amount of money to Israel goes in a lump sum pretty much at the beginning of the fiscal year. That means that since we are operating at a deficit, all of the money that we send to Israel, we have borrowed that money. And we then